The worst storms don't always begin with snow. Sometimes they begin with one small decision that changes everything. The wind arrived before the warning ever reached the mountain roads. It swept across northern Montana with a voice so deep it rattled windows, bent pine trees, and sent loose snow swirling across the empty highway like restless ghosts. Meteorologists would later call it the blizzard of the century, a once-in-a-generation storm that buried entire towns beneath more than 6 feet of snow and trapped thousands of families across the state. But none of those headlines mattered to Ethan Brooks. At that moment, all he cared about was getting his 9-year-old daughter home before sunset. His old Ford F-150 rumbled along the narrow two-lane highway, its heater working just hard enough to keep the windshield clear. Beside him sat Lily Brooks, bundled inside a faded blue winter coat that had belonged to her cousin years before. Her knitted hat kept slipping over her bright eyes every few minutes, and each time she laughed softly while pushing it back into place. Ethan smiled without taking his eyes off the road. Those little laughs had become the soundtrack of his life ever since losing his wife 4 years earlier. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. He wasn't the kind of man anyone noticed walking through a crowded grocery store. He fixed fences, repaired barns, hauled lumber, and accepted whatever honest work the week happened to offer. Some months were easier than others, but every dollar he earned had the same purpose waiting at home. Lily never complained about hand-me-down clothes. She never asked why other kids had newer toys or bigger houses. She simply believed her father could solve almost anything. Ethan wished he believed the same about himself. The truck radio crackled through another weather bulletin. Emergency advisory. Historic winter conditions are developing faster than expected. Residents should avoid unnecessary travel immediately. Ethan glanced toward the dark clouds gathering over the mountains. They looked wrong. Heavy. Silent. As though the sky itself was holding its breath. "Daddy?" Lily whispered, pressing her forehead against the passenger window. "Do storms get scared?" Ethan looked at her, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "Because sometimes they look like they're trying to hide the sun." He chuckled quietly. "Maybe they're just looking for someone brave enough to keep smiling." Lily smiled back. "Then they'll never beat us." Her confidence warmed him more than the truck's old heater ever could. For another 10 miles, neither of them spoke. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the windshield, almost beautiful in their innocence. Then everything changed. Without warning, the wind slammed into the truck so violently the steering wheel jerked beneath Ethan's hands. Snow exploded sideways instead of falling, transforming the open highway into a wall of white. Visibility disappeared in seconds. The road vanished beneath fresh drifts. The familiar yellow centerline dissolved into nothing. Ethan eased off the gas pedal immediately. "Hang on, sweetheart." His voice remained calm, even though his heartbeat suddenly doubled. Lily reached over and quietly held his arm. She trusted him completely. Outside, the world had disappeared. No passing cars. No ranch houses. No fence posts. Only endless white stretching in every direction. The truck crawled forward at barely 15 miles an hour. Every few seconds, another powerful gust shoved against the doors hard enough to make the entire vehicle shudder. Ethan searched desperately for any landmark he recognized, but the blizzard erased everything. Then, through the swirling snow, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. A pair of faint headlights blinked in the distance before disappearing again beneath the blowing snow. Someone else was stranded out there. Ethan tightened both hands around the steering wheel. He could keep driving and pray they reached safety before the storm buried the road forever. Or he could stop for complete strangers when every minute now mattered. Beside him, Lily quietly watched the fading lights without saying a word. She already knew the kind of man her father was. The storm had only just begun, but somewhere beyond the white horizon, destiny had already begun looking for them. Ethan did not answer. Right away. His eyes remained fixed on the fading headlights that appeared and disappeared inside the storm like a candle fighting against an ocean of wind. Every instinct told him to keep moving while the truck still could. Every mile they gained now could mean the difference between reaching shelter and becoming another rescue story on tomorrow's news. But another voice, quieter and older, spoke inside him. It was the voice his father had raised him to hear long before life became difficult. If you can help someone without abandoning your own principles, you do not keep driving. Lily looked up at him with calm blue eyes. She never asked whether they should stop. She already knew the answer. "Daddy," she said softly, "they are probably scared." Ethan nodded once. "I think they are." She smiled the same gentle smile that always reminded him so much of her mother. "Then we should not leave them alone." Ethan exhaled slowly. "You always make the hard choices sound easy. Mom used to say kindness is easier than regret." The words settled quietly inside the truck. For a brief moment, neither of them heard the screaming wind outside. They only remembered someone they both loved deeply. Ethan turned the steering wheel carefully toward the faint lights. Snow scraped against the doors in thick waves, and the tires slipped before finally finding enough grip to crawl forward. Every foot felt uncertain. Every second demanded patience. Finally, the truck emerged beside an aging sport utility vehicle buried nearly halfway beneath fresh snow. Its hazard lights flashed weakly through the blizzard, growing dimmer with every passing minute. Ethan parked several yards away to avoid becoming stuck himself. He reached for his heavy coat. Lily immediately grabbed his sleeve. "Please be careful." He smiled warmly. "I always try." She reached into her backpack and handed him a small flashlight. "You forgot this. Looks like I have the best partner in Montana." She grinned proudly as he stepped into the storm. The cold struck like a wall. Snow whipped across his face with enough force to sting his skin, and the wind stole every breath before he could finish it. Keeping one hand against the truck for balance, he slowly made his way toward the stranded vehicle. Inside sat an elderly couple wrapped in blankets. The man lowered his window only an inch. "Thank goodness," he called over the wind. "Our engine died 20 minutes ago." Ethan leaned closer. "Is anyone hurt?" "No, just cold." The woman managed a tired smile. "We were trying to get home before the roads closed." Ethan glanced toward the highway. It had completely disappeared beneath drifting snow. "Do you have food?" The man nodded. "A little. Water. Enough for today." Ethan studied the vehicle carefully. It was obvious the engine would not restart in these conditions. Even if it did, the tires would never climb through drifts that were already reaching the bottom of the doors. "Listen carefully," Ethan said. "Do not leave the vehicle. Keep your blankets around you. Start the engine only if it comes back, but do not waste the battery trying over and over." The man looked discouraged. "What about you?" Ethan glanced toward his own truck where Lily patiently watched through the windshield. "We are going to keep moving until we find help." The woman reached into her purse with trembling hands. "Please take this." She held out several folded bills. Ethan gently pushed her hand back. "Keep it. But you stopped for us." "Because someone would stop for my daughter if she ever needed help." The elderly woman's eyes filled with grateful tears. She whispered, "God bless you." Ethan simply tipped his hat before fighting his way back through the snow. Inside the truck, warm air slowly returned to his frozen hands. Lily handed him one of the peanut butter sandwiches she had packed that morning. "Did they need it more than us?" she asked. Ethan looked at the sandwich, then back toward the stranded couple barely visible behind the curtain of snow. Without speaking, he wrapped the sandwich inside a clean napkin, climbed back into the storm once more, and carefully placed it through the narrow opening of their window. When he returned again, his gloves were covered in ice, but his expression seemed lighter somehow. Lily reached over and squeezed his hand. Mom would have smiled. Ethan looked out across the endless white landscape where daylight was already beginning to fade beneath thick clouds. He smiled quietly. "I think she already is." Neither of them noticed that high above the storm, a rescue helicopter briefly crossed the darkening sky before turning east, unable to see the lonely truck disappearing deeper into the heart of the blizzard. The truck continued forward until even the slow crawl became impossible. The tires spun helplessly beneath the growing weight of fresh snow, throwing white powder into the air before sinking deeper with every attempt. Ethan eased off the accelerator immediately. He knew better than to fight the mountain. Winter always won arguments like that. He switched off the engine to save fuel and listened. Silence settled over them for only a second before the wind returned, shaking the truck with long, mournful gusts that sounded almost human. Lily pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders and looked through the windshield. There was no road anymore. There was no sky either. Everything beyond the glass had blended into one endless curtain of white. "Are we lost?" she asked quietly. Ethan turned toward her with the same calm expression he had worn ever since the storm began. "We know where we are. We just cannot see where we are going." She thought about that for a moment before nodding. Somehow his answer made sense. Ethan reached for the emergency kit stored beneath the back seat. It was an old plastic container held together with faded duct tape, but inside it everything had its place. 2 wool blankets, 3 bottles of water, a package of crackers, a flashlight, extra batteries, hand warmers, a first aid kit, a small camping stove with 1 fuel canister. He laid everything across the seat carefully, counting each item twice. Lily watched without speaking. She knew this was not fear. This was preparation. "We have enough food if we are careful," Ethan said. "Enough water, too. We stay warm. We stay patient. We make good decisions one at a time." Lily smiled. "Like building a snowman." He laughed softly. "Exactly like building a snowman." She pointed toward the crackers. "Then we do not use the whole box." "For the hat." Ethan smiled wider than he had in hours. "Very smart." Outside, daylight faded faster than normal beneath the heavy storm clouds. The inside of the truck slowly turned gray, then blue as evening settled across the mountains. Ethan switched on the flashlight for only a few seconds before turning it off again. Every battery mattered now. Every small choice could become important before morning. Lily reached into her backpack and removed a folded piece of paper. The edges were bent from being opened so many times. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was the last Christmas card her mother had ever written before she became ill. Lily never traveled without it. She unfolded it carefully and smiled as though hearing her mother's voice again. "She wrote that home is wherever love waits for you," Lily whispered. Ethan looked away for a moment, blinking slowly. The words carried both comfort and ache. "She was right," he answered. "Even in a storm?" "Especially in a storm." The truck rocked gently as another wave of wind swept across the mountains. Snow piled against the doors until the lower edge of each window began disappearing beneath white drifts. Ethan checked his phone again. Still no signal. Not even 1 bar. He set it down without frustration. Complaining would not create a cell tower. Lily noticed him rubbing his hands together. She quietly opened another hand warmer and placed it inside his gloves before he could object. "You always take care of me," she said. "Now it is my turn." Ethan looked at his daughter with quiet amazement. Children often learned from what adults said. Lily had learned from what he did. That realization filled him with more pride than any paycheck ever could. Minutes stretched into an hour. The storm never weakened. Instead, it seemed to grow heavier, burying the truck inch by inch. Then, through the roar of the wind, Ethan heard something unexpected. It was faint. Barely more than a distant bark carried across the snow. He lifted his head immediately. Another bark followed, closer this time, then silence. Lily looked toward him. "Did you hear that?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I did." She leaned closer to the frosted window, trying to see beyond the swirling snow. "Maybe someone else is out there." Ethan listened carefully. The sound came again, steady, determined, almost as if something was searching instead of wandering. He could not see anything through the white darkness, but deep inside, a quiet feeling stirred. Sometimes hope did not arrive with flashing lights or loud engines. Sometimes it arrived on 4 paws, leaving only small tracks across the snow for those willing to believe there was still a way forward. The sound came again, clearer this time. 1 sharp bark. Then another. Ethan lowered the driver's side window just enough to let the sound through before the freezing wind rushed inside. He listened carefully. It was not random. It came in steady intervals, followed by silence, then another bark from slightly farther away. Almost as if something was waiting for them to follow. Ethan closed the window and looked at Lily. She had already heard it too. "Do you think it is a dog?" she asked. I do. Do you think it belongs to someone? Ethan paused before answering. Around these mountains, dogs usually have a reason for being outside. Lily looked toward the white darkness beyond the glass. Maybe somebody needs help. Ethan rested both hands on the steering wheel. That possibility had already crossed his mind. Every decision now carried risk. Staying inside the truck was the safest choice if rescue teams already knew their location. But no signal had reached his phone for hours, and the storm continued burying the vehicle beneath fresh snow. If the truck became completely covered overnight, even experienced rescuers could drive within yards without ever seeing them. He quietly studied the map stored in his memory. There had once been an old ranger cabin somewhere north of this highway, built decades ago for winter patrols. Most people believed it had been abandoned years earlier, but abandoned did not always mean useless. Sometimes 4 walls and a roof were enough. Lily watched him thinking, "What are you deciding? Whether we wait for help or whether we start looking for it?" She nodded thoughtfully instead of answering right away. That was another habit she had, inherited from her mother. She believed important questions deserved patient answers. Finally, she said, "If we leave, we stay together." Ethan smiled gently. Always. He opened the emergency kit once more and divided their supplies. Each backpack received 1 bottle of water, several crackers, hand warmers, a flashlight, and an extra pair of dry socks. He wrapped another blanket around Lily before zipping her coat completely to her chin. Her scarf covered everything except her bright eyes. "Can you walk through deep snow?" he asked. She answered with quiet confidence. "As long as I hold your hand." Ethan reached into the truck bed and removed a bright orange tow rope. One end he secured carefully around his own waist. The other he fastened loosely around Lily's winter coat. "What is that for?" she asked. "If the wind becomes too strong to see each other, we stay connected." She looked down at the rope and smiled. "Like mountain climbers." "Exactly." Before opening the door, Ethan looked around the truck one last time. This old vehicle had carried them through birthdays, school concerts, grocery trips, and countless ordinary days that now felt precious. He placed one handwritten note beneath the windshield wiper with their names and the direction they planned to travel. If rescuers reached the truck first, they would know the two of them had not simply disappeared. The moment the door opened, icy wind wrapped around them. Snow reached nearly to Ethan's knees, and each step demanded slow determination. He held Lily's gloved hand firmly while sweeping the flashlight across the white landscape. The beam reflected off millions of swirling snowflakes, revealing almost nothing beyond a few yards. Then the bark returned. Closer now. Ethan lifted the light again. A large Siberian Husky stood on a small ridge of snow about 30 feet away. Thick white and gray fur blended almost perfectly with the storm, yet its blue eyes reflected the flashlight with remarkable calm. The dog did not bark again. It simply looked at them, turned, walked several yards, then stopped and looked back. Lily squeezed Ethan's hand. "It wants us to follow." Ethan remained still, studying the animal. There was no fear in its posture, no aggression, only patience. The husky turned once more, disappearing briefly behind blowing snow before reappearing farther ahead. Again it stopped. Again it looked back. Ethan felt something impossible to explain settle quietly inside his heart. Some moments asked for proof. Others asked for faith. He looked down at Lily. She nodded before he even spoke. Together they took their first steps away from the buried truck, following the silent guide whose fresh tracks stretched like a narrow ribbon of hope across the endless white wilderness. The husky never hurried. It moved with quiet confidence, placing each paw carefully into the deep snow before pausing to make sure Ethan and Lily were still behind it. The storm swallowed every sound except the endless song of the wind, yet somehow the dog always seemed certain of where it was going. Ethan tightened his grip on Lily's hand as they followed the narrow trail of fresh tracks. Every step demanded effort. Snow reached above Lily's boots, forcing Ethan to lift her over the deepest drifts whenever the trail disappeared beneath new layers of powder. She never complained. She simply wrapped both arms around his neck for a moment before climbing back down to keep walking. "Are you tired?" Ethan asked gently. Lily looked up at him with determined eyes. Only a little. Tell me the truth. She smiled. I am tired, but I am not giving up. Ethan squeezed her hand. Neither am I. The wind shifted again, carrying tiny crystals of ice that sparkled briefly in the beam of the flashlight before vanishing into the darkness. The cold settled into Ethan's shoulders and legs, making every movement slower than the one before. He could feel the weight of exhaustion trying to creep into his thoughts, but he refused to let it stay. Lily needed calm more than she needed speed. Remember the camping trip by the lake? He asked. She nodded immediately. The one where we burned the pancakes. Ethan laughed softly. I still think they tasted fine. Daddy, they tasted like charcoal. That is a little dramatic. Mom laughed so hard she almost dropped her coffee. For a few precious moments, they both laughed together. The sound seemed almost impossible in the middle of such a powerful storm, yet it reminded Ethan of something important. Hope did not always arrive after hardship. Sometimes hope walked beside you through it. The husky stopped again and looked back. Its ears lifted as though listening to something hidden beyond the wind. Then it turned left, leading them toward a line of snow-covered pine trees that had remained invisible until they were only a few yards away. The forest offered just enough shelter to soften the strongest gusts. Ethan immediately noticed the difference. The air still felt bitterly cold, but the trees broke the force of the wind, allowing both of them to breathe more easily. This is better, Lily whispered. Much better. Ethan knelt beside her and brushed snow from her coat. He checked her gloves, her scarf, and the color of her cheeks. Everything looked encouraging. He opened one backpack and handed her a few crackers along with a small sip of water. Little bites, he reminded her. We make everything last. Lily accepted the food without hesitation, then broke one cracker in half. She held out the other piece toward him. You eat too. Ethan smiled. I am not very hungry. She folded her arms. That is not what you tell me. He could not help smiling wider. You remember everything. The important things. He accepted the cracker, and together they ate in comfortable silence, while snow drifted gently through the branches overhead. The husky remained several feet away, sitting patiently with its tail wrapped around its paws. It did not beg for food. It did not bark. It simply watched them with calm blue eyes, as though understanding they needed a moment to gather their strength. Ethan quietly reached into his pocket and found one small piece of dried beef from the emergency supplies. He walked over and held it out. The dog accepted the gift gently before giving one slow wag of its tail. Thank you for not leaving us, Lily said warmly. The husky blinked once, then stood and began walking again. Ethan looked upward through the tall pine branches. For the first time since the blizzard had begun, he noticed something unusual. The snowflakes seemed slightly smaller now, and somewhere beyond the thick clouds there was the faintest suggestion of pale light. It was not sunrise. It was not clear weather. But it was enough to remind him that no storm, no matter how historic, could hold the sky forever. Carrying that quiet thought in his heart, Ethan adjusted the backpack on his shoulders, reached for Lily's hand once more, and followed the faithful dog deeper into the forest, unaware that only a few hundred yards ahead, a weathered wooden cabin had been waiting through countless winters for the exact night they would need it. The trees slowly began to thin, and the husky picked up its pace without ever running too far ahead. Ethan noticed the change immediately. The dog no longer stopped every few yards to make sure they were following. It moved with quiet certainty, as though it finally recognized something familiar beyond the curtain of snow. Lily brushed fresh flakes from her eyelashes and looked ahead. I think it found something. Ethan narrowed his eyes, searching through the swirling white. At first, he saw nothing except towering pines and endless drifts. Then, almost hidden beneath heavy snow, a dark shape emerged between the trees. It was little more than an outline at first, but with every careful step it became clearer. A steep roof. A stone chimney. A small porch nearly buried beneath snow. Ethan stopped for a moment, hardly believing what stood before them. A cabin, he whispered. Lily smiled so brightly that her tired face seemed transformed. We made it. Ethan gently squeezed her shoulder. Not yet. First we make sure it is safe. They climbed the short path leading to the weathered building. The wooden walls had faded from years of harsh winters, and thick snow rested against every window. The porch creaked softly beneath Ethan's boots, but the structure itself appeared strong. The husky waited quietly beside the front door, its tail moving slowly from side to side. Ethan tried the handle. Locked. He walked around the cabin, checking each window carefully. On the far side, he discovered one small utility door that had not closed completely, probably forced open by years of shifting wood and freezing temperatures. He pulled gently. The old hinges groaned before the door opened just wide enough for them to step inside. The air was cold but still. More importantly, there was no wind. Ethan closed the door behind them, and for the first time since leaving the truck, silence filled the room. It felt almost sacred. Lily looked around with wide eyes. Dust covered the wooden table. Shelves lined one wall. A cast-iron stove stood near the stone fireplace, and several neatly stacked pieces of firewood rested beneath a bench. "Somebody has been here," she whispered. Ethan nodded. Not recently, but someone cared enough to leave supplies. He searched the cabin carefully, calling out politely even though he believed it was empty. No answer came. Only the quiet creak of old timber settling beneath the weight of the snow outside. In one cabinet, he found matches sealed inside a metal container. In another, several candles, a kettle, and a small tin holding packets of oatmeal and dried soup. Everything had been left with care, as though the unknown owner understood that one difficult winter night could change someone's life forever. Ethan knelt beside the wood stove and carefully arranged several dry logs before striking a single match. The tiny flame flickered uncertainly, then caught the kindling. Within minutes, the first gentle crackles echoed through the cabin. Lily stretched her cold hands toward the growing warmth without saying a word. Ethan watched the orange glow spread across the room. It reflected softly against the old wooden walls, replacing fear with quiet hope. He removed their damp gloves and hung them near the stove to dry. Then he heated a small pot of water and stirred in one packet of soup. The simple meal carried the comforting smell of herbs and vegetables, filling the cabin with a warmth that reached far beyond the fire itself. Lily accepted the steaming cup with both hands. "This is the best soup I have ever had." Ethan smiled. "I think hunger improves every recipe." She laughed softly. "Maybe love does too." He looked into the dancing firelight for a long moment before answering. "I think your mother would agree with that." While Lily slowly finished her soup, the husky walked quietly to the fireplace and lay down beside it as though returning to a familiar place. Ethan noticed an old leather collar around its neck. Hanging from it was a small brass tag worn smooth by time. He gently brushed away the dust until one word became visible in the firelight. "Ranger." Ethan looked toward the walls of the cabin and suddenly noticed several framed photographs covered with age. One showed a younger man wearing a forest ranger uniform. Beside him sat the very same husky, only years younger. Ethan exchanged a thoughtful glance with Lily. Neither of them knew who the ranger was, where he had gone, or why his faithful companion had appeared in the middle of a historic blizzard at exactly the right moment. But one thing had become beautifully clear. Sometimes the greatest miracles did not arrive with impossible signs. Sometimes they arrived through the quiet faithfulness of a friend who simply refused to let strangers face the storm alone. The warmth of the fire slowly pushed the cold from the room, but Ethan did not allow himself to relax completely. Years of hard work had taught him that comfort could become carelessness if you stopped paying attention. He added another log to the stove, checked the windows for drifting snow, and made certain the chimney continued drawing smoke properly. Outside, the blizzard still ruled the mountains, but inside the little cabin, hope had finally found a place to rest. Lily had wrapped herself in one of the old wool blankets and sat near Ranger, gently stroking the husky's thick fur. The faithful dog closed its eyes for a moment, looking completely at peace. "I think he has been waiting for someone," Lily whispered. Ethan glanced toward the weathered photographs hanging on the wall. The ranger in the faded picture wore a broad smile, one hand resting on the same dog's shoulder. Time had faded the colors, but not the affection between them. Maybe he has, Ethan answered quietly. Curious, Lily stood and walked toward a small bookshelf tucked into the corner. Most of the books were old guides about forests, wildlife, mountain weather, and search and rescue techniques. Between two worn journals, she noticed a simple wooden box. Daddy, look. Ethan carefully opened it. Inside rested a compass, several neatly folded maps, and a leather notebook protected inside a waterproof cover. The first page carried only one sentence written in careful handwriting. If this cabin ever saves your life, leave it ready to save the next traveler. Ethan read the sentence twice before smiling softly. That explains everything. Lily looked up at him. Somebody wanted strangers to have another chance. Yes, Ethan replied. Kindness can keep working long after the person who offered it is gone. He turned several more pages. Most contained notes about snowfall, wildlife sightings, and trail conditions from many winters earlier. Near the end, one entry caught his attention. The ranger had written about training Ranger to locate stranded travelers during severe storms. The dog knew the safest routes through the forest, remembered the location of the cabin, and had helped guide lost hikers more than once. Ethan looked toward the sleeping Husky with new appreciation. He was never wandering, he said quietly. He was doing exactly what he was taught to do. Lily smiled. He is still helping people. Just then, Ranger lifted his head. His ears stood alert, and he walked slowly toward the front door. He did not bark loudly this time. Instead, he gave one short, calm sound before looking back at Ethan. Ethan listened carefully. Beneath the fading roar of the wind, another sound slowly emerged. It was distant but unmistakable. An engine. Very faint. Very far away. He opened the front door only a few inches. Cold air slipped inside, carrying the soft hum once again. It disappeared almost immediately beneath another gust of wind. Ethan closed the door. Did you hear it? Lily asked. I think I did. Hope flickered inside both of them, but Ethan refused to make promises he could not keep. It could be a snowcat. It could be a rescue vehicle. Or the wind may be playing tricks on us. Lily nodded with surprising maturity. Then we wait. They returned to the fire. Ethan used one of the old maps to estimate where the cabin stood in relation to the highway. If his memory was correct, they had traveled less than a mile through the forest, although the storm had made every step feel much farther. That meant rescue teams searching the abandoned truck might eventually notice tracks leading toward the trees if the snowfall eased. Hours passed peacefully. The storm outside gradually lost some of its fury. The windows no longer shook with every gust, and the silence between the winds grew longer. Just before dawn, a pale ribbon of light slipped through the frosted glass, gently touching the wooden floor. Lily noticed it first. Daddy, she whispered with a smile, the sun remembered us. Ethan looked toward the window and felt something deep inside his heart become lighter. No, he said softly. It never forgot us. At that exact moment, Ranger stood, wagged his tail once, and walked to the door again, his bright eyes fixed on the growing morning light as though he already knew someone was finally coming through the snow. The first sound was so faint that Ethan wondered if he had imagined it. Then it came again, stronger this time, rolling gently through the quiet morning air after the storm had finally begun to loosen its grip on the mountains. It was the steady hum of an engine climbing through deep snow. Ranger stood at the door with his ears raised high, his tail wagging slowly as though greeting an old friend long before anyone else could. Ethan opened the cabin door just enough to look outside. The world had changed overnight. The violent curtain of snow had become a peaceful white landscape stretching beneath a pale winter sky. Sunlight filtered through scattered clouds, turning every snow-covered branch into shimmering silver. Fresh drifts blanketed the forest, untouched except for the narrow trail of footprints that had brought Ethan, Lily, and Ranger safely to the cabin. I hear it too, Lily whispered as she stepped beside her father. Ethan nodded. Stay close. Minutes later, a bright orange snowcat appeared between the trees, moving carefully over the uneven terrain. Behind it followed another rescue vehicle equipped with emergency lights that flashed softly against the snow. The vehicle stopped several yards from the cabin, and 3 members of the county search and rescue team climbed out wearing heavy winter gear. One of them removed his goggles the moment he saw Ranger standing proudly beside Ethan. The man's expression changed instantly from professional focus to complete disbelief. "Ranger," he whispered. The husky barked once and trotted through the snow with surprising energy before stopping in front of the rescuer. The man knelt immediately, wrapping both arms around the old dog with a smile that carried years of memories. "I cannot believe it," he said quietly. "You found them again." Ethan exchanged a curious glance with Lily before stepping forward. "You know him?" The rescuer stood and gently rested one hand on Ranger's shoulder. "Everybody in our department knows him. My name is Daniel Carter. I am the lead ranger for this district." He smiled warmly at the faithful husky before continuing. "The man in those photographs was my father. He built this cabin into an emergency shelter almost 30 years ago. Ranger worked beside him on dozens of winter rescues." Ethan looked toward the cabin in quiet surprise. "Your father left supplies for strangers." Daniel nodded. He always believed that nobody should lose hope simply because a storm arrived first. His eyes settled on Ranger once more. "After my father retired, Ranger disappeared into these mountains. We searched for him, but eventually everyone believed he had chosen to spend his final years here." Daniel smiled through eyes that had become unexpectedly emotional. Apparently, he never retired from helping people. Lily knelt beside the husky and gently hugged his thick neck. "He saved us." Daniel nodded with deep respect. "That sounds exactly like him." Another rescuer approached carrying a small medical bag. After a brief check, he smiled reassuringly. "You both look tired, but you are doing remarkably well." Ethan thanked him quietly. Daniel glanced toward the trail leading away from the cabin. "Our helicopter spotted an abandoned truck yesterday afternoon, but the storm was too dangerous to search the forest. This morning one of our crews noticed footprints leading away from the highway. Ranger made the rest easy." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. "Before we became stranded, we stopped to help an elderly couple whose vehicle had broken down." Daniel looked surprised. "That was you." Ethan nodded. Daniel smiled. "Our Western team rescued them just before midnight. They kept telling everyone about a father and daughter who refused to leave strangers behind, even with the storm closing in." Ethan said nothing. He simply looked at Lily, who smiled back with quiet pride. The words were unnecessary. Daniel extended his hand. "You gave them hope when they needed it most. My father used to say that kindness always finds its way home." Looking at all of this, I think he was right. Ethan shook his hand gently while morning sunlight spilled across the snow, warming the silent mountains one golden ray at a time. For the first time since the blizzard began, it no longer felt as though they had survived by chance. It felt as though every quiet act of compassion had been leading them toward this very morning all along. The journey back to town felt strangely peaceful. The snowcat moved slowly across the white landscape, leaving steady tracks behind as the mountains stood quietly beneath a bright blue sky that had finally returned. Lily sat beside Ethan wrapped in warm blankets, holding one gloved hand against Ranger's thick fur for nearly the entire ride. The faithful husky rested comfortably beside her, his calm breathing matching the gentle rhythm of the engine. Every now and then he looked out the window toward the forest, then back at Lily, as though making certain she was safe before allowing himself to relax. When they reached the highway, Ethan immediately recognized his old truck almost completely buried beneath snow. Rescue crews had already marked its location with tall orange flags. Daniel smiled as he noticed Ethan looking toward it. "We will recover it once the roads reopen." Ethan nodded gratefully. "Thank you." Daniel looked at him for a moment before replying. "You thanked the wrong person. If Ranger had not found you first, we might have searched this mountain for another day." Ethan turned toward the old husky. Without speaking, he gently scratched behind the dog's ears. Ranger responded with one slow wag of his tail, perfectly content with the quiet appreciation. Over the following days, Life across the county slowly returned to normal. Roads reopened. Electricity came back. Neighbors helped neighbors clear driveways and repair damaged fences. The historic blizzard became the only subject anyone seemed to discuss. Local newspapers shared stories of courage, volunteers, and rescues that had unfolded across the mountains. One article carried a simple photograph of Ethan and Lily standing beside Daniel and Ranger outside the old cabin. The headline did not describe Ethan as a hero. It simply called him a father who chose kindness when fear would have been easier. Ethan quietly folded the newspaper and placed it inside a kitchen drawer. Recognition had never been what guided his choices. A week later, the elderly couple whose vehicle had broken down arrived unexpectedly at Ethan's small home carrying a homemade apple pie still warm from the oven. The woman smiled the moment Lily opened the door. "We finally found you." Ethan welcomed them inside with genuine warmth. They spent the afternoon sharing coffee, stories, and grateful laughter. Before leaving, the elderly man placed an old photograph on the kitchen table. It showed the two of them standing beside the same sport utility vehicle many years earlier. "You reminded us that there are still people who stop," he said quietly. "That gift is bigger than you know." After they left, Lily carefully placed the photograph beside one of her mother's pictures on the living room shelf. Ethan noticed the gesture but said nothing. Some memories naturally belong together. Several months later, spring arrived in the mountains. Snow melted into rushing streams, green fields slowly returned, and wildflowers pushed through the ground where endless drifts had once stood. On the first warm Saturday of the season, Daniel invited Ethan and Lily back to the ranger cabin. Volunteers had repaired the roof, replaced broken windows, and stocked the shelves with fresh blankets, food, medical supplies, and firewood. Above the fireplace hung a new wooden sign carved by local craftsmen. It read, "Leave hope here for the next traveler." Ethan stood quietly reading those words while Lily carried a small evergreen sapling outside. Together they planted it beside the front porch where future visitors would one day find shade beneath its branches. "Do you think it will grow big?" Lily asked. Ethan pressed the last handful of earth gently around the roots before smiling at his daughter. "As long as someone keeps caring for it." She looked toward the cabin, then toward Ranger resting peacefully in the sunshine. "Kind of like kindness." Ethan nodded. "Exactly like kindness." Ranger slowly stood, walked to the young tree, and settled beside it as a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine through the warming air. In that quiet moment, Ethan finally understood something the storm had been teaching him all along. Strength was not measured by how loudly someone faced hardship. It was measured by the quiet decisions made when nobody was watching. A father choosing compassion over fear. A little girl choosing trust over despair. A ranger choosing to prepare a shelter for strangers he would never meet. And an old dog choosing, year after year, to guide lost souls home. The mountains remained silent, but sometimes silence speaks more clearly than applause ever can. As Ethan reached for Lily's hand and together they began walking home beneath the bright spring sky, he realized the greatest miracle had never been surviving the storm. It was discovering that every act of quiet kindness leaves a trail, and sooner or later, that trail always leads someone safely home.